Hello, my name is Julia Volkman, and I'm going to talk about reading and dyslexia. I've studied this information during my graduate work at Harvard University's Extension School and also through my work in Montessori environments for nearly 2 decades and also other teaching environments. This talk is not about a disability, it's about the inherent variability of humans. Nature creates differences. Society interprets them as disabilities. That's a quote from my mentor and friend, Miss Sylvia Dubovoy, who teaches at the Montessori Institute of San Diego. Dyslexia is not a disability, it's variability, and it confers gifts as well as challenges. So that's a real important thing about this talk. Okay, let's begin by looking at the evolution of language and neurodevelopment. This is the foundation we need to understand what's different between typical reading development and reading development in people with reading impairment or dyslexia. So the evolution of human language reflects the neurodevelopment of language in a child. Gestures and simple spoken words came first. Then as our culture grew, language became complex and words took on new functions. We began to write in pictures. Maybe for creativity at first in the cave drawings, but then it changed to more communicative, exchangeable formats like the tablet from 3500 before the Common Era. In time, the pictures became sophisticated, like cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics. Ultimately, we assigned sounds to symbols. We created a phonetic code. You can see the Phoenician alphabet on the left and the Greek alphabet on the right, which is still in use today. This process took about 8,000 years. But today, the young child goes through the main work of creating the foundations for language in around 3 years. So just like other vertebrates, our brains became specialized for hearing and speaking. And you can see here in the human brain, this area is active when you're producing words. This area is active when you're hearing words. And in the bird brain, this area, very analogous, for hearing, and this for singing. Our ear for sounds develops in infancy. Our auditory cortex is immature at birth. And you can see here what it looks like in a 1-year-old versus how it looks in a 5-year-old. It's quite different. Plasticity for hearing the sounds in language may peak between 8 and 10 months of age. Now this is work from Patricia Kuhl's laboratory, where they studied infants between 6 and 12 months of age. They evaluated what sounds in the language they could hear and recognize at 6 to 8 months of age, and they could recognize all of the sounds at about this level. But then something changed. After a few months of development, the children who were in American-speaking homes recognized more sounds than the children in Japanese-speaking homes. Now, why was that? Well, there are sounds in American English that are not in the Japanese language, like the and o. And it seems like there may be a sensitive period when the ear fine-tunes itself to hear the sounds in language. And that may be between 8 to 10 months, 6 to 12 months, somewhere in there where that happens. We learn language by a social relationship. It's through the talking and the communication that we access vocabulary, we hear the rhythm, the prosody, the meter of language, and we understand the emotional intention, the attention of the speaker. Patricia Kuhl said, social interaction acts as a gate for infants' initial language learning. They did more work in their lab to study whether humans were required for this language learning. Could you do it with television, with recordings? They found that it didn't work well with recordings. Children who had been exposed to Mandarin by a graduate student who was reading stories to them live versus that same graduate student reading stories to them on a video had much better results if they were in the human intervention. And you can see the results here. This is how much they were able to understand the Mandarin after the intervention with the human versus after the intervention with the television. It's quite different, quite different. Children need relationship. They also need opportunities to speak. There is strong negative relationship between parents' propensity to prohibit their children's activities and their propensity to actively listen to their children by repeating, paraphrasing, or extending their children's statements. So those are all things you want to do. Active listening, repeating, paraphrasing, and extending a child's statements. A similarly strong negative relationship is seen between parents' propensity to prohibit and the likelihood that they will encourage their children to continue talking by asking a question. So get them talking, engage them in conversation, and that will support their language development. This vocabulary development based on exposure, and again, it's human exposure. This is the seminal work by Hart and Risley back from the 90s, where they looked at the number of words heard per hour in families who were professional, working class, or welfare. So this is a socioeconomic study. And they found that the words heard per year, per hour and per year, were dramatically different in the different households. And that difference became coupled with IQ. The children here, this line, they're different colors, I apologize for that. This line represents the children's IQ who are in professional families, right? This line represents the one in the working class families and this in welfare families. And this is a trajectory. It seems to continue in that fashion. So in typical development, vocabulary is very much coupled with IQ. Dyslexia is different. IQ and language development appear to be uncoupled. Here's an image from Shaywitz paper. And they looked here at IQ as the solid line in both of these graphics. And then reading ability is the dotted line. And you can see in non-impaired readers, there's a very close relationship between IQ and reading ability. But in reading impaired individuals, dyslexic individuals, there's a huge difference. IQ is typical and reading ability is down here. So dyslexia is not stupidity. Dyslexia is not low IQ. And in fact, there are many examples, which we'll talk about, of incredibly intelligent, gifted individuals with dyslexia. So understanding speech uses different cortical areas than reading. It's important to understand that because we've been focusing on oral development in the young child, and now we're going to move into the reading development. But the oral development is the foundation for what's going to happen next. Reading requires a lot more skill. And here's a list of some of the possibilities from my friend and colleague, Tracy Takahama Espinoza. Wonderful book, which you should all read, every one of her books. They're fantastic. And the types of thing you might need before you can read the sub-skills. And here it is in more plain language. You need human relationships so that you can develop your vocabulary, practice speaking, understand meaning, hear the rhythm of language, hear the phonemes in language, and experience the richness of the spoken word. You need sensorial experience. You need knowledge of the phonetic code, the symbolic systems, attentional control, writing practice, memory capacity, working memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. And there's more, but this is the big picture hit. This talk is not going to cover reading acquisition or impairment in visually or hearing impaired individuals or logographic languages. Okay, so I just want to put my disclaimer right up there. We're focused on alphabetic languages in people without significant visual or auditory impairment. So all of this that's happened thus far, evolution, has it prepared us to read? Well, yes and no. Yes and no. Some of our language networks seem to be biologically programmed to develop. And here's an image of children before 18 months and the way that their arcuate fasciculus has developed. Now that's the part that connects on the left side back from Wernicke's area up to Broca's area. And that's very important parts of the speech and reading network, okay? And that's already developing automatically in infants without trying to teach them to read at all. No one's trying to teach, well, hopefully not an 18-month-old to read. But some language areas fully develop only with reading experience. Okay, and that's what those areas in green are. Dehane did this work with illiterate and literate adults to discover what the cortical differences were. And he and his colleagues found that those areas in green were not fully developed in the same fashion in illiterate adults as they were in literate adults. And particularly, it's that posterior area of the arcuate fasciculus that ends up being poorly connected with this really important area of the reading network called the visual word form area. Okay, we're going to talk about that more. So evolution prepared certain areas of the visual cortex to respond to specific types of things. And you can see in this image that there's parts of the brain that if you see an object, this part of your brain is going to get active. If you see a face, this part. And if you see a place, this part. It's quite interesting how it's so segregated in the brain. It's not something you actually intuitively would think would happen. But there's one area of the brain that kind of develops based on exposure to the written word, based on the act of reading, and that's the visual word form area, the VWFA. Now, that area is right next to the fusiform face area, and in fact, it looks like it actually co-ops part of the fusiform face area. It takes over a bit and retrains it to be specialized in recognizing letters and words. There's a cost to this training, this evolutionary adjustment, in that we may be, literate adults may be less able to recognize faces than illiterate adults, which is quite interesting when you think about it. And this top purple line here represents illiterates and how many faces they're able to recognize, their ability to recognize faces. It's much higher than the green and blue lines down here for literate adults. So what does the visual word form area do? It and the networked regions before and after enable the rapid recognition of strings of letters and their translation into sequences of sounds. And this is an image from DeHane's work in 2015, looking at the parts of the brain that are active when good readers and dyslexic readers are looking at words, green, versus faces in red, versus places in yellow, versus objects in blue. And you can see the distinct areas are indeed much like we saw in that other graphic. But in dyslexic readers, that green area, that word area is not getting active. And this image here shows you the difference, that dyslexic readers are not as effective at reading words, but they're more effective at identifying faces. Reading disability often has a genetic basis and has been associated with a common neurobiological marker, which is the failure to develop a functionally specialized visual word form area. The visual word form area may play a larger role in visual attention than in word identification. And what that means is that here you've got your dorsal attention network. Dorsal means the back, like the dorsal fin on a fish. And that's these green dots are the dorsal attention network. And then the blue is the reading network. Now this visual word form area, many people would make that blue, but it looks like it's also green. It looks like it's very much involved in the visual attention network, not just the reading network. So the visual word form area must become connected with the entire reading network in order to read. So let's just break down this process of reading for a minute. First we see, and that's the occipital lobe, back of the head, right back there. That involves the visual attention network, right up here, and also your regular visual inputs. Remember, it starts here with the eyes are up here, and then it scoots right back to there and there, okay? Then we attach form, and that happens down here with the visual word form area and the temporal lobe. A lot of things are happening with attaching form and then finding meaning. And we've got access to meaning going all over frontal, temporal, and even a little bit occipital. And then we respond speaking or thinking the word, and that's here in the parietal lobe, but also the frontal lobe. There's executive functions happening here to coordinate and connect everything that's come together from this networked activation. It's like a reading committee. Now, I don't know if everyone who's watching has ever been on a committee, but you can't get anything done, right? So imagine that committee in your brain trying to coordinate reading. It's amazing that any of us can read. All of these parts have to work together. Now, in dyslexia, the reading networks are different. It's not the typical reading networks. And you can see in this graphic from the Finn's study in 2013, the red areas are the areas used by typical readers more than dyslexic readers, and the blue areas are areas used by dyslexic readers more than typical readers. And you can see there's significant differences in the networks for reading. There's also significant differences in the connectivity of those areas. And again, the red is for typical readers, the blue is for dyslexic readers. And you can see sometimes it's even hemispheric. Okay, it's really dramatically different. So these connectivity differences can be seen in children at risk for dyslexia before 18 months of age. That's really important to understand. This wonderful work by Langer in 2015 shows you the other half of this image we saw earlier. Here's that arcuate fasciculus, right? And this is in children without a family history of dyslexia. And here it is in children before 18 months of age, as young as 6 months of age, with a family history of dyslexia. There's significant differences in the architecture of that critical aspect of the reading network. Now, we use our brain differently based on the language we learn. This is really important. Again, this talk is focused on English and alphabetic languages. Okay, but here you have this wonderful image from Ziegler where you see the activation in an English speakers or French or Italian speakers reading network. Very similar areas of the brain get activated. But here's what gets activated in a Chinese speaker's brain. What's missing, right? We've got our visual word form area, tons of activity over here. Where's the visual word form area on the side? It's not happening. That points to the fact that there are different types of dyslexia because you can still have dyslexia in Chinese, but it's not caused by the visual word form area, okay? You may be dyslexic in Chinese, but not in English. There's different parts of the brain that are involved. There are different types of dyslexia. So what are the key points thus far? It took 8,000 years for humans to develop written language, and it takes the child only about 3 years to become fully wired for oral language. It's an incredible transformation that happens. The visual word form area was not evolutionarily meant for reading. We have to teach it how to read, and that's through reading exposure. The whole brain has to work together in order to read, and dyslexic readers develop atypical reading networks and may have an underactive visual word form area. Okay, so what is dyslexia? That's the $100 question, right? The $100 million question. It's low reading achievement despite adequate intelligence, education, and motivation. So like we saw, IQ is uncoupled from reading ability, so you can be quite intelligent and still have difficulty reading. But the key thing is that you've had adequate education. You've been shown the relationship between phonemes and symbols. You've had exposure to oral language, as would be expected for a typical human. And you're interested. Interest really does matter. So it means that you'll end up with inefficient reading and spelling skills. Okay, about 5 to 10% of the population is affected. And there are many different possible components to dyslexia. Generally, a phonologic deficit is considered a core deficit in dyslexia. There can also be difficulty linking the graphemes with the phonemes, difficulty accessing sight words, and visual differences, not just needing glasses. And then there's a lot more, on and on and on. And this image, I love this image because it really speaks to the diversity and complexity of dyslexia. So there's not just, you think it's just, oh, they can't see the letters, they can't understand the sounds, but no. There can be spatial temporal difficulties, memory difficulties, motor control challenges, writing challenges, listening challenges. It's complicated, and it's a mosaic of possible areas that are involved. So what does it look like? I know when you're teaching in preschool classrooms, or if you're working with young children as a parent or family member or friend, you will often see around age 5 children who are writing letters backwards. And it can happen earlier or a little later. So this is normal. And we'll often think, oh no, are they dyslexic? We wonder. And first of all, you shouldn't go, oh no, because it might just mean, ooh, they're going to have some great talents, which we'll talk about later. But it's just normal oftentimes. So that's not the sign you're going to look for, okay? I want to say that first. This is what it looks like when a 7-year-old with one type of dyslexia writes a note. And you can see there's no real left to right organization. The spelling is quite unexpected. And some words are missing. Let me give you the translation here so you can see. And this is a note my son wrote when my husband brought me flowers. Hi, Adam, I am fond of the beautiful flowers you gave to Mom. Thank you. And you can see, hi, Adam, I am fond of the beautiful flowers you is missed out altogether, gave to Mom. Thank you. Right? So there's letters are all over the place. They're all over the place. That's dyslexia. So it's not just because of our crazy English spellings. Dyslexia is seen in alphabetic languages, but even the simple ones, like Italian, which are really phonetic, and they're also seen in logographic languages like Chinese. Spelling difficulties tend to be found no matter which language is studied. So let's look at what typical reading pathways look like. There's generally two ways of reading. There's sounding it out when you don't know a word, especially when you're a young reader and you're just learning to read. You sound everything out. That's called the phonologic route. And that's the process of linking seeing, and here's the activity when you see a word, with hearing a word. We're linking those things. That's phonics, linking hearing and seeing. And then as we gain more experience, we use the lexical route. We see a word, we recognize it, we don't have to sound it out anymore. And this is what that looks like. So again, this is for alphabetic languages. So it starts over here. When we're young, we sound everything out. Okay, we go all the way around, sound it out, find what it means in our lexicon, which is our inner dictionary of words and vocabulary that we know. That's why vocabulary is so essential for reading. And then we kind of access pronunciation and we can say the word. All right, that's the long route. The short route, we see the word and we recognize it. We don't need to go further. We convert it to sound, boom, we're done. All right. Generally, skilled readers use that short route. Okay, they recognize it, they're set. Dyslexic readers tend to use the longer route. The long route taxes working memory in the phonological buffer, okay? So when you're working with someone with dyslexia, or if you have it yourself, you may notice that you get tense and stressed. Many of your brain's resources may be going to holding things in working memory, which means there's not a lot left for other tasks. So if people interrupt you, if there's noisy environment, it can be difficult because you have so much effort that's required to maintain things in working memory. It really takes away your capacity to do anything else. There's more than one way to read. That's one typical route, the phonological and the lexical route, and it's similar to what Fisher and Rose, also two great Harvard MBE people, did in this graph. They're illustrating the same process. But they also did research and found that there are other processes, other ways in which people recognize words. Okay, and here's one they outline here, and here's another that they outline here. So there's not just one way. Our brain will create little workarounds if one way doesn't work. Here are some of the neurological findings you'll see in dyslexia. You'll see a visual bias for the periphery over the central. You may see disrupted connectivity or decreased myelination. You may see limited use of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex for rhyming tasks. Fewer connections between posterior, temporal, and prefrontal lobes. That's here and here. You may see abnormalities in the cerebellum, way back here in the area involved with space, with motor plans and balance. Temporal lobe atypicalities, right? And this may be caused by prenatal error of neuronal migration. Okay, so this may all stem from this little prenatal hiccup that happens, driven by genetics or causes fit into the reading network. You have impaired visual attention up here. Magnocellular theory is the whole occipital lobe, right? The impaired auditory processing would be generally executive and parietal and temporal, actually. And then a phonological deficit would really be focused down here in the visual word form area in the temporal lobe. So a lack of specialization in the visual word form area is seen in many subtypes. If you have an impaired visual word form area, it may cause a traffic jam in the rest of the reading network. So efficient information transfer doesn't happen. The information can't easily move past this area, which means that the rest of the network doesn't get the neural tuning that would happen from repeated reading exercise. So the more you read, generally in a typical reader, you gain more experience for those networks and they get pruned and strengthened, lengthened, and specialized. But if you have reading impairment dyslexia, it's difficult to get that practice for the rest of the network because you get this bottleneck in the visual word form area. And so what are the implications, right? Practice makes permanent. Montessori said the mind is made by the work of the hands, right? It's critical that children and adults get enough practice reading, even if it's hard, so that they can strengthen the rest of the network after wherever their bottleneck is happening. Now, it may not be in the visual word form area that the trouble is for one individual. It may be in the occipital lobe. It may be an issue of visual attention. Okay, there are many possibilities, and this is one. If there's difficulty with visual attention, the reader may neglect some of the characters in a string. For example, they would read thudder if they saw the word thunder. They might miss a letter or two. And this would happen with regularity. It wouldn't just be the occasional blip. And this is a picture from the Lobier study of some of the examples that they gave people as they were running these attention tests. So again, this is up here in the reading network, okay? So if your visual attention is impaired, think about how the information is going to be able to move past that part of the reading network and on to the rest. Again, just like with the visual word form area, if you've got a bottleneck in one spot, it's going to affect everybody else downstream. One interesting study found, and actually there's a good bit of research on this, but that's a topic for a different talk, on how motor practice influences visual attention. And this motor practice seems to direct the attention and help actually map spatial attention in the brain, create motor programs. So if you're tracing, like these children are tracing, those are sandpaper letters used in a Montessori classroom. And if the child is tracing the letter L, they're also saying the sound the letter makes. They're saying O when they trace it, O, like that. And so they're getting a motor program that is linked with the phonetic sound of that symbol, right? So the thinking is that that would create some connectivity in the brain, and that would be really quite useful for explicit instruction. So the other interesting thing about visual attention and motor programs is that if you have this motor program developed, that when you see the letter or the word in the future, you actually don't have to trace it to activate the motor program. So if you see that this child's traced the ol enough, they have a motor program, and then later they just see the ol and they just know ol. And that motor program actually gets activated in their brain even if they're not moving their hand. It's fascinating. So in this way, you can understand why writing practice may improve reading. And that's what Kersey and James studied, in fact. So they found that the self-generated production of cursive letters during learning led to the recruitment of a sensory motor network known to also be active during letter perception and reading. So that's what we were just talking about, right? But passive observation of a letter being formed did not. So if you watch somebody else write it and you don't have experience writing it yourself, it doesn't have the same benefit. You have to have experience. You have to apply yourself. Make effort to get the benefits, the full benefit. So let's look at auditory processing. So that's specifically with dyslexia, there seems to be a decreased ability to hear clearly as sound intensity changes over time. And so by sound intensity, we mean classical musical pieces that go from piano piano, piano, to forte, forte, really loud. So you've got that kind of dynamicism in the sound, but also the rate at which certain sounds go up and down, rise and fall. So if you're saying something very, very, very quickly, a lot of words, then sometimes you have a lot of little up and downs. And that's what these images are showing you, ups and downs of syllable production. Sometimes there's a quick rise, quick fall, slow rise, slow fall. Okay? And in dyslexia, it seems specifically that there's some trouble with the rise time, the upward moving part of the amplitude. And actually, if you have trouble with that in hearing tests, that may be predictive of future reading difficulty. At least, again, if you have this one type or form of dyslexia. So if you're looking at someone to see, oh, do they have this auditory processing challenge, you might notice that they have really impaired musical rhythm. Now, be careful with that one because, I know a lot of people who are incredibly brilliant and great readers who don't have a lot of rhythm. Okay, so just be careful of that. But simple rhythm tasks, like you see, like banging rhythm sticks together in children. Also, you might hear something that's quite curious, and it's a timing difference in syllable production, okay? So when you're saying a word, you might erd. It's not a stutter, but there's a pause, crack, cur. So you'll hear these pauses in words that they say unexpectedly. And if you notice that, it may be a sign that something's up with auditory processing. So here I just wanted to show you an image of the auditory processing network to show you that there are many areas that are geographically similar to what's happening in the reading network. And again, like we said before, the auditory cortex is immature at birth. And what really is exciting about this is that myelination, and myelination appears to be driven by experience. Myelination happens heavily in the auditory cortex up until around age 4, 5, or 6. And then you're pretty much done and your auditory cortex is myelinated. But still, after that time, there's a lot that's happening in development up until around age 12 in auditory cortex, at which times it reaches adult levels. So this is good to know, because it indicates there's still plenty of opportunity to influence the development of auditory cortex if we notice early enough that something isn't quite as expected. And in fact, there's some research that shows that auditory training may help in dyslexia. Now, in this particular study, they had children turning this little dial right here, and they were trying to match the auditory rise time of tone A with that of tone C. That you'd use this dial to try and get them to come together. And apparently that had some benefit in reading outcomes. So let's look at the Magnocellular theory. This is talking about difficulty in visual processing. And this image is showing you that vision starts in your eye, goes back to your occipital lobe, and then there's a dorsal stream, which is what we're going to focus on. There's also a ventral stream, and different type of visual information is processed differently. We won't go into that for this, though. But just that in the magnocellular system, we're talking about the dorsal stream developing more slowly than the ventral stream. So again, possibility to influence development. So when we talk about vision, often people are thinking about 20/20 vision. Oh, my vision's 20/20, I don't need glasses. That's not necessarily what we're seeing with reading impairments. There may be other vision anomalies, like unsteady fixation, a dissymmetry between how this one's moving, the saccades, the natural ways that our eyes move. There may be attention difficulties, neglecting certain things, or other problems. So it's not just passing the eye exam. If you pass the eye exam and you still have reading difficulties, it doesn't mean your visual field is not involved, your visual system is not involved. So one issue here is central versus peripheral bias in vision. And it's really quite interesting to find that if you're a typical reader and you look at this image, you can see that the reads is clear and you get your information from reads and the rest is a little bit blurred out. So this is an exaggeration to indicate what a central bias looks like. So, but here in this image, it's trying to show you what a peripheral bias would look like. So typically, if we have that central bias, we look at a hand and we get all our information from just 2 degrees right here of what the hand is. But if you have a more peripheral bias, you're going to look at that hand and you're going to get information from a much larger area. Okay? You're going to get the hand, but you're also going to get this whole periphery. That's a lot of information that's coming into the brain that the brain has to organize and sort and process. So if you're looking on a page, it may be hard to focus in on one string of words, letters, or words. Now, what about convergence and sufficiency? Some of you have probably heard of this, and this is something that would not come up on the eye exam, just like a central versus peripheral bias wouldn't come up on the eye exam. Convergence and sufficiency is talking about what happens if your eyes don't team together to see depth. And it means reading can be quite painful if that happens. It might look really confused when you look and you get a headache because your eyes just aren't working together. And so, of course, you're not going to want to read. Looking at a page gives you a headache, right? This was first recognized back in the 1800s, and the first vision therapy was introduced a few years after, called orthoptics. So today, there's still vision therapy going on, and a growing body of research that suggests that treating convergence insufficiency can improve reading performance. And here are some images showing you children doing vision therapy. They're focusing on the blue dot, focus on the yellow dot, and they're going to have another red one down there. And they're going to take turns looking at each one just to train the eyes to work together, to give them visual experience. In this image, he's got red and green glasses on, and he's looking at this board with red and green things on it, and he has to point to specifically certain things, so coordinating the vision with hand movements. And again, there's some evidence that indicates that this is beneficial in improving reading. However, that evidence is not agreed upon by everyone, and in fact, optometrists and the American Academy of Pediatrics does not think there's a lot of evidence to support the benefit of vision therapy. This seems to be kind of a political battle between the optometrists and the ophthalmologists. So there seems to be some good data, but it's being a little poo-pooed. However, there's a new study that's being conducted right now and should be out in 2017 that hopefully will take a really great look at this and give us some better information on if it's beneficial or not for dyslexia. So how is dyslexia treated? Well, based on the evidence of the root causes, what would you suggest? I mean, there's spatial, there's writing, there's listening, so you might want to increase phonological awareness, train visual attention, train auditory processing, right? All of these different possibilities. And remember, each individual is going to have a different presentation of this, so you would want to consider the child as a complete person, as a complete mix of possible contributors to reading difficulty. So far, there are many possibilities for treatment, but no silver bullet. And my big question is whether we're trying to make a one-size-fits-all treatment for dyslexia, even though we know that dyslexia is heterogeneous. So here are some commonly used methods that don't have much evidence available to support them, but they're used in school districts all over the country. Here's an example, this repeated reading program. There's very little evidence to support the efficacy of repeated reading. Spelling mastery, where you get explicit, direct spelling instruction. There's a little evidence that it might help with writing achievement, but not in other parameters. Reading mastery, where you get explicit, direct instruction in reading. There's no strong evidence at all to support that. The Lindamood Phoneme Sequencing work. There's some evidence to support that. It teaches the lip, tongue, and mouth actions needed to form words, so it really focuses on the oral aspects, the motor aspects of speaking, and sequencing and reading and spelling based on those oral features of words. And there's some evidence that it supports reading fluency, mathematics as well, and alphabetics. Not really writing achievement, and may have negative effects there. And then fast forward, computer program, right? Everybody wants computer training. Put them in front of the computer. You can go and, do your laundry, right? Okay, so this computer game or games were intended to build listening, accuracy, phonological awareness, and language structures, okay? So again, this is not intended for the very, very young child. This is for older children. And there is mixed evidence. Some of it is quite compelling and others of it is not. Part of the challenge with Fast Forward may be a bit of a controversy on how the data was presented. Dr. Michael Merznick is the founder of Fast Forward. He's also a research scientist, and some of his studies didn't quite go through the typical peer review process. So they may be valid, but replication is really required. The good news is that it looks like computerized training can increase typical reading network activity. And here's some work shown in the Dehane book where you have the activity seen in normal readers and then the activity in dyslexic readers before training. After this computer training, there was improved activity in those areas in dyslexic readers. So there's a possibility. And of course, there are apps. Hand your phone to your kid in the back seat while you're driving in the car, give them something to do. The apps can be specific training to teach them phonemic awareness or sound letter correspondence, or the apps could be supportive, like a dictaphone, so they could dictate things that they have to write because they can't quite get the spelling down to write it themselves. Or it could even be screen reader software so that they don't have to read the web page, they can have it read to them. Many possibilities there. And again, my question is there a lack of consideration of the subtypes when we think about treatments for dyslexia, interventions to support people with reading impairments and dyslexia? We have to think of the whole person. There's not, one size fits all. So, and I love this, challenges become gifts. This is work from Livingston, where he looked at the eyes of people who were accomplished in art specifically in other areas and saw that they looked like maybe they had some convergence differences in their eyes and how their eyes were looking. But it didn't stop them from being extraordinary artists. And maybe indeed this different visual status is required for great artists. Do we know? Also, a potential gift of dyslexia is that peripheral bias. If you have that peripheral bias and you're looking at a star field, you may see patterns that a person with a central bias can't see. And then, as it turns out, there's an inordinate number of astrophysicists who have dyslexia. And Harvard actually has a section, the Harvard Center for the Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics at Harvard, where they study dyslexia, the visual learning lab there with Dr. Matt Schnepsheimer. There are all these astrophysicists, right? There's also a lot of physicians and other scientists who have received the Nobel Prize, and they have severe dyslexia. So why? How could they do that, you wonder? How? And it seems like it was their interest in the subject matter that allowed them to persevere, to overcome, and really focus in on a topic while overcoming their reading challenges. So what a successful dyslexic will do is you'll find they substitute words a lot. They don't get hung up. If they can't read a word, they often will know the context of what's being said, and they'll be able to substitute an appropriate contextual word so that they're not stuck and just always trying to sound things out, but they can go past it. That's a skill for successful dyslexics. If you see that in someone that you're teaching or coaching, it's not something you need to change. It can be a quite useful adaptation. Okay, so dyslexic adolescents, all the success, right, in sciences, well, what about creativity? They're actually rated higher on creativity than typically developing adolescents. All right, and let me just show you some of the work here. So one task they had to do was to make something out of this shape, and here's the shape. And here's what a university art student made, right? Wow. And here's what a typical reading 14-year-old made. Pretty basic. Now here's what a 13-year-old with dyslexia made. A 12-year-old with dyslexia. Another 12-year-old with dyslexia. La tortue chaise de feu. This is great. So creativity may influence business, right? Entrepreneurs with dyslexia. Here are a few very well-known ones who are extremely successful. Okay, dyslexia hasn't stopped them and actually may have enabled them to be creative. It may be that different wiring pattern that these are some of the gifts that are conferred with that. So it's this inspiration, interest, compassion that accesses more brain real estate. And this is a study by Mary Helen Immordino Yang, Mary Helen, out at University of San Diego. And she looked at compassion and inspiration, motivation, and what that did in the brain when you hear a story that really moved you versus something else. How would that change the way your brain worked? And she found that basically inspiration, compassion really accessed more brain real estate. And so if you're thinking about someone with a reading impairment, if you can inspire them or if they become inspired, then they have potential to build little bridges around the difficult connectivity in their reading network. They may be able to get over the gaps that they have. That's why inspiration and interest and following someone's interest is so important. So, based on all of the above, here are Julia's top recommendations for working with people with dyslexia, yourself or anyone else, or reading impairments. Okay, first, when they're young, bountiful early exposure to oral language, including music, rhymes, and poetry. You need that rhythm and prosody. It has to be from humans who care, right? That's how we really learn from each other. Explicit learning lessons on phonemic awareness and letter sound correspondence. What does that mean? It means, you're having a drink and you say, I'm going to give you the cup, up, cup. Simple as that, okay? As they get older, you can isolate the sounds. Say, can you find something that starts with k, right? Or could you find something that starts with the sound k and ends with the sound p? Or could you find something that starts with the sound k, ends with the sound p, and has the middle sound a? Okay, just to help isolate the phonemes in language. Very simple little things. If they're not getting their sounds by around age 4, 3, 4, 5, and they've had plenty of exposure, explicit instruction, great vocabulary, good human language, then it's really time to make it a daily routine, just like brushing your teeth, right? Daily routine, daily work on hearing the sounds in language and linking those sounds with the symbols of language. And in the Montessori program, that's done by the sound game and the sandpaper letters. Also playing memory training games. Some really simple things you can do when you have a few moments, you're waiting for somebody, waiting for something, just, let's bring me a sock. Go stand next to the aloe vera plant. Go touch the fridge. Anything like that. It's memory training. And it's movement, and it really can be fun to fill those moments when they might otherwise get into a little mischief. All right, also linking interest to the written word. Whenever you can, interest will just really help people overcome and persevere in reading. Also, make sure they're getting enough sleep and outdoor time. Sleep is critical. People need so much sleep, and we're so sleep deprived, and that can dramatically influence our executive functions, and we're using those executive functions when we're reading up in the front, especially working memory, okay? And then outdoor time, especially for visual development. So our visual field needs these stereoptic experiences of binocular vision, of depth. When we're outside, we're focusing at depths all the time. We notice a bird, we see a leaf on a tree. We see something small on the ground, an ant. And we're constantly changing our focal length. This is really important for visual field development, that type of experience, which also means less screen time, because that screen time is not going to give you the depth exposure that you really need, okay, especially for younger children. Also, regular study of musical instrument. Now, there's a little bit of data on this, particularly with respect to executive functions. It'll help. Not so much that I've found with respect to dyslexia, but if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense to help train the visual field to coordinate movement and to work on prosody and rhythm. Also, let everybody know it's not their fault. The family, the person themselves, you, if it's you, it's not your fault. There's a genetic basis to reading impairment, to dyslexia. Unless you've had some kind of a traumatic brain injury or some kind of an illness, generally it just happens. It's not usually the result of environmental situations, okay? So get off your back and focus on solutions rather than a challenge, okay? And remember that everyone has challenges and gifts, and with dyslexia, there are some really great gifts that come along with it. everything is workable. Brains are like faces. They're inherently variable and inherently similar. And this is what makes the rich mosaic of humanity, and this is what makes us such a gorgeous species, right? It's this variability. We can overcome. If you have a challenge, your brain can overcome it. And here's an example of a child at 4 years old. She had to have this part of her occipital lobe removed for a difficult situation she was in. So you're thinking, this is, well, what's there, right? The reading network left, right? She's never going to read. That's what they thought. Well, they were wrong. At age 11, she was reading, and they looked at her brain and they found out that she used, here's her empty cerebral spinal fluid, part of the brain, and she used this right hemisphere where typical people would use the left. So it's possible to overcome even severe challenges. You just need to make effort. So dyslexia is not disability, it's variability, and it has challenges as well as gifts. I always like to end with my favorite quote, that peace cannot be kept by force, it can only be achieved by understanding. So we can't force people, we have to inspire them to do the work that needs to be done to reach their full potential. Now I'll just show you the references for a few minutes, but that's the end. Thank you for listening. You made it.